Good morning, everybody. So I'm here today to talk a little bit about, not a lit, quite a bit about our Beyond the Trees project. This project I've been actually part of for a number of years before my current role. This project was proposed by my former team with the Government of Saskatchewan's Forest Service. It was presented to the Healthy Landscapes Program activity team, and it was approved a couple of years ago now. So without further ado, so this project's goal is really to look at and examine the potential impacts, if there are potential impacts by disturbances, specifically wildfire and silviculture systems on culturally significant understory vegetation with Indigenous communities within Saskatchewan and Alberta, within their traditional territories, as well as the forest management areas. We're seeking to gain a better understanding of what, where, when, and how various understory vegetation species are used currently and were used by these Indigenous communities. And ultimately, we want to know, does forest harvesting and their subsequent silviculture treatments and wildfires impact this lower vegetation? And I'd like to point out throughout the presentation, you'll see a number of photos, and a lot of them I've taken in a lot of my past work, working with communities and working up in northern Saskatchewan. So I hope you enjoy those photos. So when the project was proposed, it was proposed in a multi-phase approach. So phase one was really about community engagement and trust building, and building that trust process with the communities and with the forestry companies. And also developing a literature review to see if there have there been any studies in the past that have looked at culturally significant species and any impacts from forestry, any impacts from wildfires. Phase two will be to look at field trials and design some field trials with the communities and with the forestry companies, as well as some field visits. And phase three will be community-based monitoring. And our partners throughout this have been the Indigenous communities, industry, and government, specifically currently the Government of Saskatchewan. There are a lot of benefits to this project that were identified, but I think ultimately building the relationships with the Indigenous communities was really an important part of this project, building those relationships with the forestry companies and the Healthy Landscapes program. Another benefit is the actual identification of culturally significant species through the research itself and the community engagement. And ultimately, this project's design, as well as the data or traditional knowledge gathering and any future research, is really collaborative in nature. And that's been a real benefit in having the communities trust in this process, in this project, and as well as having the forestry companies participate as well. So in terms of project design, before we even approached the communities, we needed to do a literature review. And that was completed by a graduate student and will be released to HLP activity team members for review. This literature review goes through lower vegetation dynamics and regeneration from post-harvest and post-fire, as well as a variety of silviculture treatments and any studies that have been done in that area. Again, when I was part of this project, I was part of the Forest Service at that point in time with the Government of Saskatchewan. So with the former program coordinator for HLP, I worked specifically with forestry companies in Saskatchewan to identify the communities in Saskatchewan. And the former program coordinator worked with companies in Alberta to identify communities in Alberta. And then we get into the important aspect of traditional knowledge. When you are collecting traditional knowledge, it can be really difficult within a project to have communities trust in that data collection, in that traditional knowledge collection. So we decided to propose developing a data sharing agreement, which would go through the process of that data collection as well as the ownership. And in reality, that was to build trust with the communities, that this information wasn't just going to be thrown everywhere, that they had access to it, that it was their information, and FRI was just there to house that information. And finally, we had to develop a methodology of how do we go about and collect this traditional knowledge, and how do we do the community engagement. So there was a lot of back and forth between us, for when I say us, when I was formerly with the Forest Service and the former program coordinator, on developing interview questions that would really get to the crux of what we wanted to answer. So we looked specifically at getting a little bit of information with regards to the community members themselves who are participating, what species they're using, where they're finding those species, any impacts they're seeing on those species, pre-harvest, post-harvest, pre-fire, post-fire, and any potential solutions they could recommend in terms of going about protecting those species or working further with the companies to identify those species. And after we developed those interview questions, we then developed a kind of engagement session workshop protocol. So this is what we came up with. This was our suggested workshop approach. So when we approached the communities, we proposed 3 workshops. So the first workshop would be working directly with chief and council or leadership. And this would give an idea of, were we on the right track with the questions that we were proposing to the community? Were they accurate? Were they appropriate to ask? As well as we went through the data sharing agreement and any important information in terms of protocol when working with that community. Workshop 2 would be more designed to work with elders and knowledge keepers. And then workshop 3 would be more with the general community. So land users, teachers, youth, any other important community members identified by that community we were working with. As well as when we would approach the communities, we would ask them to propose a member of the community that we would go through or work with that would help facilitate the workshops, help coordinate the workshops. And our ultimate goal was to build that relationship through that person. And then after that, the facilitator and the program coordinator would then produce a summary from each engagement session. So with a lot of projects comes challenges, and this project definitely had some challenges and still does with deliverables and project timelines. So initially, our original timeline was we wanted from April 2023 to October 2023, we wanted to narrow down and identify the communities we'd be working with in both Saskatchewan and Alberta. We wanted to establish a project team, develop a terms of reference, and develop the interview guide or interview questions. And then from November 2023 to March 2024, we wanted to get the engagement, the workshops done with the communities. Unfortunately, it didn't really work out on the Alberta side right away, but we were able to identify and work with two communities in Saskatchewan, which I'll talk about soon. And we were able to complete that literature review as well in that timeline. And then from April 2024 to October 2024, we wanted to potentially get some field sites or field visits done just to see these areas that the communities were identifying as problematic, and then get the final reports out during that time frame. So again, challenges. Capacity was a huge barrier for community participation in terms of human capacity and other priorities as well, because we tried to do a lot of this work during summer. And unfortunately, summer is really bad for wildfires. So this project was last on the list for communities wanting to participate or having the time to participate. Also, sorry, there was a lot of mistrust in forestry and with research and with government. And so we really had to work hard to build those relationships. And there were a lot of visits. Again, I'm speaking strictly on the Saskatchewan side for now, because remember, I was part of the Forest Service at this point in time. So we really had to meet with these community representatives in these communities outside of the project and get to know them to build that trust. Also, lack of interest. Communities aren't always interested in participating in your project. They have other projects on the go, other work on the go, other reviews they're doing, other groups they're part of. So they're, when you're approaching communities and they might not just be interested, they may not be interested in participating. And it was the case on the Alberta side for this project. And again, building relationships with Indigenous communities takes time and it's not immediate. And that really challenges timelines. And ultimately, there was a big issue in terms of the gap between HLP program coordinators. The previous program coordinator left before the end of phase one in Saskatchewan, and there was a 6-month gap between that person leaving and then myself taking on the role. So in the meantime, some of those relationships, at least in the Alberta side, may have not been developing or became stagnant. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the results that we've gotten on the Saskatchewan side. And these are some initial ones. I can't share everything because we still have to go back to the communities, talk about what was collected, and make sure everything is appropriate and accurate. So we worked with 2 communities, Isle La Crosse. Isle La Crosse has a really good relationship with Mystic Management. They're located in Northwest Saskatchewan, and they deal with a lot of wildfire activity. Their traditional lands are within the Toko and Mystic FMAs. And so with Isle La Crosse, we had 3 workshops. The first workshop, we met with their leadership, which is the ISC4, which is a group of representatives from the municipality, from the Métis, Fishermen's Association, and Trappers Association. Workshop 2, we worked with elders and knowledge keepers, and workshop 3, we worked with youth. As you can, if you recall from the proposed workshop approach that we had suggested, they tailored it a little bit in terms of workshop 3. They strictly wanted to work with youth because they wanted to get them more involved. They want to get them more involved on the land. And they thought that they could give a fresh perspective of some of the impacts that they're seeing from their point of view. The other community that we eventually got to work with was Atakakook Cree Nation. They are located in Saskatchewan in the Boreal Transition Zone. Generally, they have quite a bit of mistrust of government and forestry companies, but we were fortunate enough on the Saskatchewan side of things with the Forest Service that my former particular team built a really good relationship with the community, and ultimately they decided they wanted to go forward with the project. They had their traditional lands are located within the Island Forests and Sagao forest management areas. And in terms of workshops, again, it was tailored to what the communities really needed or really wanted. So workshop 1, we met with Chief and Council. Workshop 2 and workshop 3 were both with the general community members. So some initial results from Isle La Crosse, it was really interesting to see the different responses from the communities. So Isle La Crosse is a Métis community, but they also have a municipality. They have a history of fishing, and the waterways for them are really important for life. Something that was mentioned during these workshops was traditional knowledge for this particular community has been eroded over time, but they're working on relearning many of the practices and protocols and knowledge that have to do with the land. So some things that were noted during the workshop, there were concerns with clear cutting, that clear cutting degrades and destroys cultural vegetation such as mint and Labrador tea. It displaces wildlife, and it's limited access to harvesting areas for some of those land users and trappers out in that community. But the biggest concern for this particular community is wildfire impacts and concerns. They're seeing more frequent and intense fires in their traditional areas. They're concerned about the let it burn policy, as they call it in Saskatchewan. They're seeing regrowth in some of these areas is really slow or lacking after wildfires. And there's potential impacts to the water as well. There was a really bad fire last year, and it was noted that a lot of the soot, a lot of the stuff from the fire was washing into the waterway, and it was really intense, and the community members are really worried about what those impacts will have on their fishing on their waterways. And in terms of suggested solutions and recommendations, they recommended more collaboration and co-management with other forestry companies. Like I said, they have a really good relationship with Mystic, but they'd like to see more collaboration with other companies. They'd like to see inclusion of community members in surveys and monitoring. It was interesting to note that during one of the workshops, the question was posed about the regrowth of trees afterwards. And it was clear that the community members didn't, at that particular meeting, didn't know that forestry companies are regulated to go out and replant. So there's this communication aspect that is missing, and perhaps including them in some surveys and monitoring would help with that communication breakdown. It was also suggested that there could be a prescribed burn following a harvest to add those nutrients back into the soils to help with regrowth of their significant species, and also to identify and monitor culture vegetation in wildfire prone areas to take note of what is there and what is not coming back afterwards. So Atakaku Creek Nation, they have a long history with the forests and with resources. Their forested landscapes have played a really critical and important role to this community. So cultural use of understory vegetation, they rely on shrubs, herbs, fungi, lichens found beneath trees, and they harvest them for food, medicine, and spiritual uses. Some examples are mint, wild turnips, wild onions, cranberries, shaga. And some of their general observations is they've seen a decrease in availability and accessibility of some of these plants. Like I said before, there's quite a bit of difference between this community and Isle Cross, in that this community doesn't really see a lot of impacts from wildfires in comparison to Isle Cross. So their main concern is forestry and forestry impacts. So in terms of concerns of silviculture practices, they said that clear cutting is disrupting and removing vegetation. The heavy machinery could be impacting and degrading the soils. And it was interesting, one person mentioned that in her area with her cabin, where there was forestry activity, some of the mint in some of those areas is not coming back. And so that would be an interesting area to go study, to find out why is mint, which grows like a weed, why is that not coming back? What happened? And they're also seeing changes in numbers and movement of wildlife. So wildfire versus harvesting. Wildfire, from this community's point of view, wildfire is viewed as natural cycles. So it prompts new growth. It brings animals back to the area. It's a good thing. Wildfire is seen as an ally. They do some cultural burning. And clear cutting, they view clear cutting as negatively impacting culturally significant or important species. Some of the solutions and recommendations from this community: forest management practices should consider traditional knowledge within those practices. Perhaps there could be some smaller harvest sizes in areas with large amount of these cultural species. And they'd like to see more collaboration with forestry companies, more co-management. So what's next? So as I mentioned before, we're going to be visiting with the Saskatchewan communities to go over and discuss the results and what the next steps will be with those communities. I am creating a series of smaller reports from the data collected, which will be reviewed by the communities first. Then it will go out to the industry partners, and then it'll go out to the general HLP activity team. I'm happy to announce that we are going to be beginning phase 1 with the Alberta communities. I have 2 workshops set up with Tall Cree Tribal Council, which will happen in mid-March. So I'm very excited. That's been a relationship developing over the past month. And so I'm very excited to be working with this community and get to know them better. And potentially Fox Creek Development, which is located in Hinton, but they have traditional areas, and some of their traditional areas within the West Fraser FMAs around Hinton. And then hopefully phase 2 will be happening in spring and summer 2025. But again, that's really dependent on what the wildfire and what the community priorities are at that point in time. I'm hoping it will be, but we shall see. So phase 2, field workshops. to further understand observations. So we really want to look at a pre-harvest site, post-harvest site, say 2 years, post-harvest site, say 14 or 15 years. And then we want to compare that. Again, we want to compare wildfire and harvesting. So pre-burn, post-burn, 2 years, post-burn, 14 or 15 years. We then want to design research trials that would explore silviculture treatment's potential influence on those chosen species, on those culturally significant identified species. And really phase 2, in terms of a business case, it's continuing to build on those relationships, build and act on the findings of phase 1, which will help further build relationships and trust with the communities and the forestry companies as well. And hopefully the research trials will expand our knowledge and support continual improvement of practices, potentially increasing biodiversity, multiple uses of the forest, and social license to harvest. And before I end, this project has been really interesting. Like Julie had mentioned, I've done a lot of work in the past with Indigenous communities. And so I was constantly and still am learning what a successful project looks like. And so from this project, some of the lessons I personally learned so far: building relationships takes a lot of time. Sometimes virtual is not the way to go. Phone calls are not the way to go. In-person visits are preferred. And trust must be built first before a project can really get going. Cultural protocols are different for every community. This is really important because if you were to go to a community and bring, say, cloth and tobacco, is it appropriate or not? Tall Cree, cloth they do not participate in the Sundance. Therefore, cloth is not appropriate, just tobacco. There's other communities that they don't take either or. And so it's really important to, when you're working with the community, for us, we work directly first with one person, a community coordinator. To ask those questions is critically important because it shows respect and it shows a willingness to learn and build that relationship with the community. It's really important to acknowledge expectations and reality right away. Initially, when this project was developed, there was a sense that this project was going to change policy. It was going to change legislation. And that's not the reality. The reality is the project is there to build these relationships, get this information, and then potentially there could be some small changes to practices, right? In terms of, okay, so there's more mint in this area, or there's more wild blueberries. Can we identify what part of that area is, or can we go out and collect seeds to make sure that those plants are going to be there afterwards? Again, we really set out from the beginning that this is not a policy change project, but it was a build relationships, potentially small practice change project. Developing a project, including the design methodology with communities, can add in the project success. So again, we came to the communities, we proposed a workshop approach, and that didn't really work out. It didn't work for those communities. And so being flexible in the way that you approach your project is critical for its success and its continuation. Language used is very important. Forestry language is sometimes not well understood. When we were continuously on one of the workshops using silviculture, and then finally somebody put up their hand and asked what that meant. And so we really had to reevaluate some of the language we used and how we used it, because outside of practitioners and professionals, not a lot of people know the forestry lingo out there. Differences in words. Example, will impact versus potential to impact. So we don't know at this point in time, does harvesting and subsequent silviculture practices, does it impact, or is there a potential to impact these species? So again, the use of the words is different between will and potential. There's a difference between language preferred and used by communities, companies, and government. Again, I go back to will change policy versus will potentially change some practices. That was critical in terms of how we presented this project initially to communities, and in addition to any kind of materials that are being developed currently and will be going out. And finally, I'll go back to capacity. Capacity is a really big barrier. And from this project and from previous experience, it's even if a community at that point in time does not have the capacity to participate, there's always an opportunity to go back to them in the future or to assist in that capacity building. So with one of the communities, I really worked closely with them to make sure that paperwork was in order, all these other tasks that I could take on versus them to help with that capacity. That was a big key for the continuation of that community within this project, especially going into phase 2. And that's all I have. Does anybody have any questions?